This podcast is brought to you in partnership with EVA International Media Limited. Hello and welcome to Down to Earth with Terry Virts, where we talk about what matters down here on planet Earth. And today I'm really excited to have Robert Auers on our podcast. Robert is RBN Energy's primary refinery modeler and refined fuels market analyst. He graduated from the University of Texas in Austin in 2013 with a BS in chemical engineering and went into the industry, the oil and gas industry. He's an expert in petroleum refining and also renewable fuels. So Robert, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So energy is a big deal to me. It has been since I was a kid. I think it's one of the most important issues down here on Earth. I've had a lot of different folks on the podcast. I'm a big fan of making smart science-based policy decisions. And I think a lot of times we make ideological-based, emotional-based energy decisions. Europe has made some really bad decisions. I think America has too. So I want to talk about in refineries has been an issue recently. And you were the expert at my good friend Rusty Brazil's energy company. So I want to talk about fossil fuels and how we should look at them. They're looked in this like evil thing, or some people are just slavishly devoted to them. But I want to look at it like kind of dissect what the industry is. And one of the things that I think is important to understand is that there's an upstream, there's a midstream, and there's a downstream. It's not just gas at the pump. There's a lot of different complicated aspects of this industry, right? So can you break that down? You got supply and demand, and you've got upstream, midstream, and downstream. So there's a lot of complicated things happening in that market, right?
Yeah, and a lot of people can confuse that they don't understand that whole value chain. I mean, obviously you have the upstreams, the production side, and there's all different types of production, from shale to deep water, gas weighted or oil weighted. And then you've got to move.
Describe production. What is production?
All right. So you have, that's not my area of expertise.
Okay.
Because I'm a chemical engineer. But essentially, ideally, in the ideal situation in conventional oil reservoirs, you dig a big hole in the ground down to a high pressure oil reservoir, and it just flows out because it's under high pressure. And then as the reservoir starts to deplete, you can pump water in or pump CO2 in the other side to build up the pressure and keep oil or gas flowing. But eventually that runs out. And then we have other tools like fracking, where you can access oil that's trapped in small pockets of porous rock. And so you can frack it to fracture that rock so it'll all flow out. And there's, you could drill below the ocean. You could drill, some reservoirs are shallow and easy to access. Some are, 10,000 feet below ground. And so it just depends.
So that's the whole thing. We won't talk too much about production, but when you hear production, I think of refineries, but that's not what it is. You mean drilling into the ground to get crude oil, liquid, and also there's a lot of different gases that come out, right? NGLs, is that the right term?
Yeah. So NGLs would be when natural gas, when you get crude oil, usually comes out with natural gas, at least some level of natural gas. And sometimes you get dry gas that's almost 100% natural gas, and you really don't need to do a lot of treating on it. Now, when we have shale gas, it's almost always wet gas, and it has a lot of NGLs like propane and butane and even C5s like natural gasoline in it that ultimately are going to make it into gasoline. And when you have that, you need to do some processing to remove those heavier molecules that are actually more valuable than natural gas. You need to remove those molecules, or else they'll condense in the pipeline and they'll condense out. And so you can't keep those in there because you can't compress it with those molecules dissolved in there.
So NGLs are a liquid that comes out of the ground that's not crude oil, and it's not natural gas, and it's even more valuable than
less valuable than crude oil, but more valuable than natural gas. And most of them are gaseous at room temperature and pressure. I mean, so we have like propane and butane. Butane will become a liquid at atmospheric pressure. It becomes a liquid at about 30, 35 degrees, something like that.
Okay.
Propane's even lighter, but when you're compressing it in a high pressure natural gas pipeline, they will condense out.
So it's not like the Beverly Hillbillies. You drill a whole ground and black oil comes out, and that's all you got. There's a lot of complicated technical things happening.
Well, and that's what it was originally. And they would have the natural gas come out too, and they would you just let that stuff vent to atmosphere. No one,
right.
No one cared about that, and no one cared about methane emissions either.
No smoking at the rig. And there's different locations, right? There's different plays. There's the Eagleford, there's Bakken, there's Marcellus, and in each place on Earth where you dig, you get different stuff out of the ground, right? There's sweet oil and heavy oil, and can you talk about that a little bit about the differences of what comes out?
Yeah, so quality it can vary considerably. Shale oil is usually light, mostly 40 to 50 gravity. So API gravity is a scale we usually use to measure density of crude oil. And anything over about 35 or so, we usually consider light. We say about 25 to 35 is medium, and under 25 is heavy. Those, it's semi-arbitrary where you draw that divider. Some people might draw it differently. But shale is usually in the 40 to 50 range. So it's solidly in the light to even, might call it super light kind of range.
And that's easier to put in pipelines. Is that true? Or what does light versus heavy mean?
If you get real heavy, there's some limit. If you get real heavy, you can't put directly into a pipeline. So that'd be like Canadian bitumen. And that stuff is basically like an asphalt type material. It's solid at room temperature. So you obviously can't put that in a pipeline. Right. So you mix it with diluent, which is usually natural gasoline or condensate, which condensate's just a very light crude oil. Or you mix it with natural gasoline, which is like a C5, C6. So it'd be the lightest component of what's in the gasoline at the pump, some of the lighter components that are in that. You mix it with some portion of that to get it down to a liquid state that you can pump. And then you can put it in a pipeline.
And that's coming out of the Alberta tar sands?
Yep, that's up. Yep.
Okay.
And there's also some, tar sands type material in Venezuela and Colombia that you also need diluent for. Venezuela, of course, their production now is very low. But we used to send a lot of diluent down to Venezuela. And if, the political situation ever changes there to a more friendly one with the U.S. and production can grow there, they would also need a lot of diluent. And some of the Colombian heavy crude, they use some diluent as well for the same reasons.
How do you get diluent again? It comes out of a refinery, or?
It comes out of a refinery, that kind of that lighter naphtha stream that could go into gasoline, or it comes out of that NGL stream from a natural gas well, that heavier part of that NGL stream, or you just use a very ultra light crude oil or condensate.
There's also sorry.
Yeah, it's just any of those. It doesn't need to be anything specific, just something light enough that you can mix it with heavy crude oil to make it pumpable.
Okay. And there's also sweet and sour. You hear people talking about that.
Yeah, so that's just a measure of sulfur content.
Okay.
The value, sweet and sour used to be a lot more important before we had ultra low sulfur fuels. And so it used to be sweet crudes you could get away without hydrotreating them. And hydrotreating is what we do to remove sulfur from our products. And we've reduced the sulfur specifications of our products to less than 15 million parts per million sulfur. And, that's meant everything has to be hydrotreated, even the sweet crudes. It used to be, so that made it easier to process sweet crudes before you had to do that. And that's for environmental reasons that we've done that.
Right.
Now, the sweet sour divide has become a little bit more important because we have these new rules called, you can call them the IMO bunker fuel rules, but it requires less than 0.5% sulfur bunker fuel.
For boats. You're talking about ships.
For ships.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, international ships. And their fuel is typically the heaviest part of the crude oil barrel, is what they use.
For shipping fuel.
For moving ships.
And Mexican crude is sour, right?
Mexican crude is sour. I mean, usually we'd say 1% sulfur. Anything above 1% sulfur is sour, below 1% sweet. But obviously, it's a spectrum. So there's varying levels of sweet and sour, and some really high sulfur crudes can be 4 or 5% sulfur. Shale crude is usually about 0.1 to 0.2% sulfur.
Some and like Saudi, there's different sweet and sour, but different refineries are set up to handle different types of crude. Is that true? You can't just take a barrel of crude from anywhere on earth and use it in every refinery. Is that true?
Yeah. And generally sweet crude is easier to process. So that heavier material at the bottom of the barrel is the most difficult to do anything with.
Right.
It's, you have to upgrade it. Either you can sell it as ship fuel, but there's a lot more of that heavy material than there is of market as bunker fuel. So especially the higher sulfur material, it's very difficult to hydrotreat that and turn the high sulfur material into compliant bunker fuel now that we need low sulfur bunker fuels. So you have to upgrade it and send it to a coker that is the main unit. And that will turn that into gasoline and diesel. Now, a refinery that's designed for heavy crude, they can't necessarily go and process too much light crude either because they might have too many light ends. So it's easier for a heavy crude refinery to make investments to process more light crude. It's a lot easier to go that way than to be a light crude refiner and go to heavy crude. And that's what we've seen in the U.S. over time. There's been a lot of talk about the U.S. refiners can only process heavy crude or medium crude. They can't handle all this shale. Well, I mean, you look at the data; they are handling the shale, right?
Right.
You can look at EIA publishes crude quality information to U.S. refiners, and you can see it, just getting lighter and lighter since 2010, 2011, when the shale crude boom started, and that's through making these incremental investments. And I've seen it at refineries; they're constantly, they're smart people, right? I mean, they're not just standing by. Right. And so they're making those investments to run lighter crude to the extent it makes sense. Now, we've also got to heavy crude is always cheaper than light crude. And so that's why we import heavy crude and export light crude, because it makes sense, right? And
so talk about that. I don't want to get too inside baseball for folks.
Yeah.
You hear America is an energy exporter, or why are we importing energy? Or there's all this political yelling and screaming by people who don't understand the oil and gas industry. So we both, even though we make more oil than we need, we're still importing oil, and we also export oil, which some people get mad about. So can you talk about that a little bit? Yeah.
So most of our exports come from Canada. By far the majority of our imports crude oil imports come from Canada, and that's material that flows on pipelines down through the middle of the U.S., pipelines like Keystone and Enbridge system.
So there is a Keystone pipeline.
There's an existing Keystone, not Keystone XL.
There's several Keystone pipelines, right?
Well, there's one Keystone right now, and they wanted to build Keystone XL, which is about 50% bigger than the existing Keystone in it. So it would increase, the capacity of that system by, 150%.
And because we canceled that, what does Canada do with their crude oil now?
Well, right now they have enough pipeline capacity.
Okay.
Because they've done other expansions across the Enbridge system, and then they have the Trans Mountain expansion coming.
Okay.
Now, the fact that there's been so much trouble getting new pipelines built has slowed production growth. So had we not opposed all these pipelines, there would be more crude oil production in Western Canada than there is right now. There are a lot of a lot of investments put on hold.
Right.
And, things that didn't happen, because if you look back to, late 2018 in particular, crude oil prices in Western Canada, bitumen went down to single digits in terms of value.
Right.
And so there were no economics. Of course, that stunted production growth. And that's one of many things that led to, the scenario we had in 2022 when we were short crude oil. Crude oil prices, went well over $100 a barrel.
Yeah. There's also been talk about Canada. They're really close to Vancouver, so they can ship their crude to China. If they can't put it in pipelines to the U.S., they'll just send it to Asia. Is that?
Well, they are building the Trans Mountain expansion, and we expect that'll be completed sometime in 2024. It's faced a lot of delays as well.
Right.
Ultimately, the Canadian government bought it, and the Canadian government is continuing to build it. And that will improve access of Western Canadian heavy crude for Asia. China will definitely be a big buyer of that material. It's going to go to the U.S. West Coast and California as well. It really, everywhere in that Pacific basin.
But so back to my point about not making energy policy decisions based on ideology. It's not like there's less gas being used or less fossil fuels being burned. We're just not importing it efficiently to American refineries. Instead, it's going to be going more inefficiently to China. And
that it is actually an efficient movement. I mean, that's a pipeline that makes sense. Okay. So would expanding to the Gulf Coast. I mean, there's a lot of material out there in Western Canada, and producing energy domestically. Let's say in North America, right? I think we can agree Canada is a good, reliable ally, and we can rely on production coming from Canada and the West Coast. I mean, we need that heavy crude in the U.S. West Coast too, and so that's provides them access to it. And, our allies in Asia, it provides, in Korea and Japan and Taiwan. And so it's a good outlet for Canadian crude, as is the Gulf Coast. More options is better.
Yeah. Okay. So I think the big picture, what you've just described, is it's a pretty complicated thing. It's not a simple just pumping oil out of the ground. There's a lot of moving parts, and the people in this industry are really smart. I've gotten to know them over the last couple of years. There was a lot of very smart folks. And supply and demand goes up and down. So there's a lot of uproar, like Shell made all this money this year and Exxon made all this money this year. But talk about the last 5 to 10 years. Like, how's it been to be an oil and gas guy?
Yeah, they got, and this is another one where refining has been different from upstream. So we go back to the first time, the first crash and recent crash in 2014, 2015, right?
Yeah.
We were summer of 2014, we're up over $100 per barrel. Everything was good. And then we started getting to, around September of that year, crude prices just kept falling. And everyone thought they can't really go below 80. They can't go below 70. They can't go below 60. And, I can't remember what the low was in early 2016, but I think it was in the 20s for WTI.
Yeah.
Right.
West Texas Intermediate.
Yes.
What's WTI versus Brent versus talk about benchmarks.
Yeah. So originally West Texas Intermediate is just light crude from the Permian Basin. And it originally flowed largely to Cushing, Oklahoma, built a big crude oil storage hub there. There's multiple tank farms. And so that became the main pricing location for NYMEX crude oil, which was a major crude benchmark. Definitely used
the
to
New York Mercantile Exchange. That's where people trade oil, right? But there's other prices for oil. Yeah. Yeah.
And that's where the physical delivery was for NYMEX crude oil, was in Cushing, Oklahoma.
Okay.
And so that became a pricing benchmark. And that was a good pricing hub. We used to import crude oil. So you would have crude coming from the Permian Basin, crude coming from the Gulf Coast, and flowing out to various refineries from there. And then we also have the Brent crude oil hub, which is in the North Sea. The actual Brent crude oil stream has negligible production anymore, but they've added more and more stuff to it. And actually, starting this year, you're going to be able to deliver WTI, U.S. shale crude, into the Brent stream because North Sea production has declined so much. And that's deliverable in Europe, in the North Sea. And so usually we say the international crude price, we use Brent. And we could say these are similar quality, right? For our purposes, the quality of Brent, quality of WTI Cushing are the same thing. Really, our difference is pricing location.
Okay.
Brent is going to be priced up in the North Sea in Europe, where it's access to the water. You can get to refining centers that are importers of crude oil in Europe. Whereas now Cushing, I said it used to come up from the Gulf Coast. Now everything is going from Cushing down to the Gulf Coast, right? And serving local refineries, but the marginal barrels coming down to the Gulf Coast. And now we have plenty of pipeline down to the Gulf Coast. So there's a pretty predictable differential between Brent and WTI. You can say it's the cost to pipeline it from Cushing down to Houston, and then to export it from Houston to Europe. And that's your differential. And that differential is going to vary based off what those costs are, especially, shipping costs can vary over time. But we had a period of time there where we were perpetually short. Well, intermittently short pipeline capacity, right? And we would see these big differential blowouts, and you would see WTI, more than $10 under Brent. And that's because there was no pipeline capacity to get from Cushing to the Gulf Coast, so it would get stranded in Cushing. It looks like we're past that permanently, unless there's some kind of big pipeline outage. But right now, we have plenty of pipeline capacity. Midstream companies built out a whole bunch of pipelines in the, kind of 2011 to 2020 timeframe. So it doesn't look like that'll ever be an issue again. But that was a big deal for a long time.
Why is production dropped off in the North Sea so much? When you think about offshore rigs, I think about the North Sea, big waves, big storms, lots of wind, like this very tough environment that these guys, oil men are drilling holes down there. Why did production drop off?
The big thing is just a mature field, and they've exhausted the resource. Like I said, initially you drill into a field, an untapped field, the oil just flows out of the ground. It's there under pressure, right. Just flows out. But as you deplete it, the pressure drops, the oil, doesn't replace itself, and it gets harder and harder to pump out that incremental barrel. And so that's where they are. And you also have, opposition to new development. Of course, we're still seeing it, right? I mean, Johan Sverdrup's big new field in the North Sea that had first production, I think, in 2019. But it's kind of the last really big new field in the North Sea. And it looks like from here on out, it's going to be continued declines.
Okay. Okay, so the things have been pretty bleak in the oil industry. I know the company I've done some consulting for, NOV, I don't know what fraction, I think they've declined by like 2/3, or there's really was a huge number of layoffs. Tens of thousands of people lost their job. So 2022 was a good year because the price went up, but the last 5 or 10 years have been pretty rough in the industry.
Yeah. I guess we kind of got off track there. Yeah. So 2014, 15, and 16, huge wave of bankruptcies. I mean, everyone got burned. It was, like I said, everyone thought the price can't go below this level, can't go below that level, and it kept going down. And just huge waves of bankruptcies, especially across smaller and poorly capitalized firms. And then, things started looking better, right? In 2016, we saw more rigs, production growing. And, by 2018, we had gotten back up to $80 per barrel on Brent. I don't know if WTI hit 80 or not, but it got close. And so everyone was feeling pretty good again in 2018. And you saw that in the equity prices as well. But then in late 2018, again, we were oversupplied. Essentially, U.S. producers, OPEC's down here making decisions too. But what really happened is U.S. producers produced too much again, right? They grew production too quickly. Demand didn't grow as fast as production grew, and prices fell again in late 2018, early 2019. We saw another wave of bankruptcies, and these were companies that were already weak, right? That were weakened by that initial, 2014, 15, 16 price crash that kind of made it through. Another wave of bankruptcies in 2019. And then, we're kind of thinking at the end of 2019, early 2020, okay, we're past it. Everyone's bankrupt, that was weak. The industry is better capitalized, better capital discipline. We're not seeing the rig counts go up as much. Everything looks more balanced. And then COVID hit, right? And so now another wave of bankruptcies. And this is the third time in, 5 years that these companies have just been burned, and, really no profits from the industry for that whole right. time period. Free cash flow. It was a bad time. Everyone at that point was really cautious. Investors are demanding capital discipline. It's just a cycle of overinvesting and then crash.
Right.
And so naturally, everyone's cautious. I mean, who wants to go invest in that environment? And then you can think about COVID as well. Airlines got to bail out. Small businesses got to bail out. Right. I mean, what do we do to support the oil industry? We didn't do anything. Instead, we're saying, oil demand's already peaked. That's it. It's going to be down from here on out. And, of course, that didn't happen. We reopened after COVID and the supply wasn't there.
The problem with COVID was demand dropped off so much. People weren't driving to work. It was a demand. It's always a supply and demand question, right?
Yeah. And the other two, they were supply driven. We can say, and those first two drops were supply driven. And the 2014 to 15 drop was a little demand driven as well. We saw demand destruction from high prices. Now, I said it was different for refining because the 2014 to 2020 period, refining actually did okay.
Mm-hmm.
And you could go look at, if you look at equity prices for Valero or Marathon or, these large refiners over that period, they did well. It wasn't, I wouldn't say it was an exceptional period for refining. There were very good periods in there. 2018 was a very good year for refining. 2016 was a little weak, but I mean, overall, that was a good period for refiners. They did well, while the upstream guys were suffering. Yeah. So refining didn't really take that big hit until COVID.
Upstream makes their money or loses money based on the price of crude, right? That's a WTI thing. If it's $20, it sucks to be a well driller. If it's $100, drill away.
Yep.
But midstream and downstream, so the pipelines and the refining, what matters to them is demand, right? They're gonna get a margin on every barrel of crude. It just depends on how many barrels of crude they're pumping. Is that like if it's $100 or $20, as long as they're making gas, they're still going to make their whatever percentage on a gallon of gas. Is that true? Is that a way to look at it?
On midstream, theoretically, it's mostly a fixed fee business, and most of it is. But we get these big overbuilds. As long as someone needs to move crude oil or natural gas or refined product or whatever from point A to point B, and your pipeline is the one that goes there, you're going to do well, right?
You'll get a couple bucks a barrel or whatever. I don't know what they charge, whatever it is. Yeah.
And potentially even more. So you could look at some companies when Permian was at a huge discount because we didn't have enough pipeline capacity from the Permian Basin to the Gulf Coast.
Right.
The companies that own pipelines there, they have marketing divisions too, and they earn these huge outside profits buying crude in the Permian Basin and selling it on the Gulf Coast and transporting it on their own pipelines and capturing the differential.
When I went to business school, that's what they taught me: buy low and sell high.
Yeah, but you could only do that for so long, right? Because you'll build out new pipelines.
Somebody else will build a pipeline, right?
Texas, there is no opposition, well, very little opposition to build a new pipeline. So that meant a whole bunch of new pipelines in Texas, because we're lucky that the Permian Basin isn't entirely within Texas. If they had to cross state lines, it might be a different story. But it was easy to build out pipeline capacity, and now we have more than enough pipeline capacity from Permian Basin to the Gulf Coast.
There's also Eagle Ford, right, which is a different part of Texas.
Yeah, and that's down in South Texas, down, not too far from San Antonio.
Yeah. Okay, so the bigger point is when you talk about oil companies making all this money, there was 2 points I wanted to make. A, that was this year, but last year, it's definitely a bust and boom.
Yeah, the last 5 years.
Maybe more than any other, right? There's been lots of down years in the last decade. It's not always like this. And there's different people in the industry. Some of them are making money, some of them are losing money. It's a different story for refiners than it is for pipelines, especially than it is for the production people. But at the end of the day, I'm just a normal person that needs gas for my car. Like, we need that industry healthy, and we need the industry efficient. And when you have opposition to pipelines, that doesn't change how many gallons of gas you're going to burn. It just means that those gallons of gas are going to be more inefficient. They're going to be more polluting, because if you have to ship oil and gas crude by rail on a train or on an 18-wheeler, much worse, you're actually polluting more than you are if you just put it in a pipeline. Pipelines are the most environmentally friendly, right?
Definitely the best and cheapest overland route for crude oil.
Yeah.
The only thing cheaper by distance would be a long distance, tanker, a VLCC, but obviously that doesn't work when you're trying to get from
VLCC, very large crude carrier.
Very large crude carrier. And so, that's what we're talking about, building export terminals in the Gulf Coast that can handle the draft, right? Because they need deep water. Right. And that's the way you ship from the Gulf Coast to Asia, from the Middle East, to Europe or something like that. That's the cheapest way to move crude a long distance over water. So ideally, all our crude is going to move over land by pipelines and over water, with large ships that are cheap per barrel cost, low fuel usage per barrel. Right. It's the cheapest and most environmentally friendly, and the two go together. Right. It's cheap because it uses the least fuel, and therefore emits the least carbon.
Right. So that's a point that I always want to bring out. There's the hidden costs or the bigger picture of things. And also there's this kind of hatred of oil and gas and fossil fuel. And I think we should be moving more towards renewables. I think there's other things we can do in some cases, but California and the European Union, I think just this week or in the last couple of weeks, they're making laws against gasoline powered cars, right? Like you have to have all electric cars. And when you do that, and I've said this on the podcast a lot, the environmental costs of batteries are not zero. There's a lot of problems with mining. Are there even enough minerals in the world to make all these batteries that we say we're going to make? And all those batteries are mostly made in China, who is a strategic enemy. They're not our friends. It's a dictatorship that is threatening Asia at a minimum. And they're made in China. The materials are processed in coal-fired Chinese power factories. So it's not. And how's your electricity made to power your electric car? Some of it's wind and solar, but some of it's natural gas and coal and so on. And so there's all these complicated factors that we need to take into account, I think, when it comes to energy.
And that's a big issue. A lot of our, climate policy, we focus just on how much CO2 are we emitting here in the US or in Europe. It's a lot of these policies have just been outsourcing of emissions to China.
Right.
Because China's willing, if it means economic growth, they're fine doing that. And how much are we actually reducing CO2 emissions, right? You could see China's, CO2 emissions, say, per unit of GDP are really, really high, far higher than any of the Western world. Now, part of that is they use a lot of coal-fired electricity, but a big part of that is they're just the manufacturing center of the world, and manufacturing is energy intensive. And so if there's something energy intensive, it just gets, outsourced to China largely.
Yeah.
And so those really are
India also. Yeah.
In India too. But those are really just, a lot of those are Western world emissions that just get outsourced to China.
Right.
Because we've decided that, it doesn't count. If the CO2 comes out of a stack in China, even though we're the ones consuming the end product, that it doesn't count. So
right.
I think that's a big thing with climate policy. We need to look at what does this really mean for global emissions? I mean, it would be usually we could produce the same thing here, probably with lower CO2 emissions, right? Because if we're smart about it, right, and we can't drive up the cost too much that it, just makes it impossible to do things here, which is, obviously a huge problem is kind of this NIMBYism, in the U.S. and in Europe.
Not in my backyard.
Yeah, not in my backyard. Anything that's perceived as dirty or whatever, there's tons of opposition to it. But we all want to consume things still. So you have to, if you want to consume stuff, you got to build factories, you got to build pipelines, you got to build, all these dirty things that we don't want to see.
Right.
You can't have stuff without that.
Without energy. And in the words of one of our famous Senate candidates in the recent election, their bad air comes over here to our good air. Anyway, but it's true. It's true. It's very true.
The West Coast, actually, in Los Angeles Basin, on some days, a lot of their pollution can come from China.
To the smog in California. Wow.
Yeah. Some of the smog in California is actually from China.
I can tell you from space, it's a beautiful planet. And the Earth really is beautiful in all places. One of the only environmental problems that this is just anecdotal with your eyes, but China is brown. It is a brown smog pit. And I was there. This was years ago. And of course, it's even much worse now. In India, it was pretty smoggy. Those were the only two countries that I could see pollution, but you can see it with your eyes in both of those countries. And it's only getting worse. I had a podcast guest, Mark Mills, really smart guy. And he made the point that we're spending lots of money to reduce emissions by a few percent, right? We're spending hundreds of billions of dollars to take off a couple percent here and there. And our last decade of emissions reductions in America were more than offset by last year's increase in coal plant production in China. So 1 year of extra coal in China wiped out a decade of gains that we've made here. And I just think we need to open our eyes and pull our head out of the sand, because China's not going to stop. We don't have leverage. We're not going to tell China what to do. They certainly are not going to listen to anything we say. India is not going to listen to what we say. And on a certain level, it's kind of immoral. Like as much as we demonize the fossil fuel industry, who wants to go back to the 19th century where the average age expectancy was 50 years? The quality of life for human beings on the planet has dramatically skyrocketed in the last century because of fossil fuels. Without that, the human misery is massive. And so we need to stop the pollution. We need to mitigate emissions. And there's ways to do that by reducing burning fossil fuels. You can do land use to suck down carbon. You can capture carbon at industrial facilities. There's lots of things you can do, but we shouldn't demonize the industry that literally gives us our standard of living. And it's hard to tell China, like, hey, look, we developed, but now you can't. And even though they're the biggest economy, they also have 5 times our population. So their per capita GDP is much less than ours. And there's lots of poor people still in China. There's lots and lots of poor people in India. So it's really, it's kind of immoral for us to tell them that they have to live in poverty while we live in wealth.
And I think, even with India, there's things we could do. We could be we could grow our LNG export capacity more than we even are. If we could be
LNG, what's LNG?
Liquefied natural gas. So the U.S. before the shale revolution, we were building out LNG import terminals because we thought we were going to be short natural gas, and we built out a lot of these, mostly on the Gulf Coast, and then we got shale gas.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
describe that. The shale revolution is something most people probably don't understand, just how profound that was. What was that?
So the origins of it can go back to the 80s, but we have some of this oil that's, instead of being in one large reservoir, it's small little pockets of oil or gas with non-permeable rock between it. And so you pump a bunch of sand and water down in there under high pressure, it fractures that rock. And so now the oil and gas can all flow. And, we had to combine several technologies, mostly horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing and improving the ways to do it to make it economic. But it started out in the Barnett, which is near Fort Worth, Texas, actually where I grew up. And I remember it being a big deal when I was in high school, wanting to drill natural gas wells, right, in people's backyards.
Right.
But they, that was the first place, and that was all natural gas. And then Barnett turned out to actually not be the best place for it. Once we found out these other fields actually were much better targets, but that's where the first operator tried it there, and it worked. And so we grew first it started in natural gas. Natural gas production just took off. And so we switched from an LNG importer to now we are, I don't know if we passed Qatar. It's basically Qatar, Australia, and the U.S. are the 3 big LNG exporters. And a lot of those LNG import terminals were converted to export terminals.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have a lot more gas that we're not producing because we don't want to build pipelines from the Northeast because there's so much opposition. And the Marcellus Shale, Marcellus Utica Shale in Western Pennsylvania, Eastern Ohio, West Virginia. Right. We have essentially an unlimited supply of gas up there.
Right.
I mean, it's really an amazing resource, and we're able to access it because of fracking, because this stuff is in shale rock.
Right.
And if we can move that down to the Gulf Coast, or you can move it to the East Coast and export it there, but that's not going to happen. But if we get a pipeline to the Gulf Coast and export it, that could be an alternative for India, because natural gas is much better for the environment than coal, right? And they would be happy to take U.S. LNG if we could supply it to them. And if we could get these pipelines built and we could foster an LNG and export industry, which we're building out, but we could build out faster with better policy. We could build out faster and build out more. That would be a really good alternative to coal for the rest of the world.
We have, and this is what brought me to NOV, we have unlimited natural gas. We have centuries worth of natural gas. And if you put a carbon capture system on that, it's not emissions free, but it's very low emission electricity. We could make, and it's 24/7, and we're not buying batteries from China. We're not buying wind turbine blades from China. Wind turbine blades are made in China. We're not buying solar panel. The entire world's solar panel industry was outsourced to China a decade ago. So we have energy security, and we haven't really talked about energy security. In 2014, I was training in Russia. I launched on a Russian Soyuz, and when they invaded Crimea, I was jumping up and down. I couldn't say anything because I was an active Air Force officer in NASA. we needed to build LNG export terminals so we could ship natural gas to Europe and undercut Russia. That's their source of income, right? And we can't do that you just said this. New York, the state of New York would not allow the pipeline to go 100 miles, instead of 1,000 miles. It's the gas is right there. All we need to do is get it to the ocean, and we're supplying Europe with clean energy. Instead, they're dependent on Russia, and look what's happening now. There's a massive war killing hundreds of thousands of people, and again, that comes down to ideology. And that was not, well, they're making the decisions for environmental reasons, but it's hurting. Even more important than the environment is security, right? And those decisions are really bad for our security and for Europe's security. And they're buying the gas from Qatar. Like, Qatar's a gas country, like Saudi and UAE are crude oil mostly, but Qatar is like the natural gas. The Las Vegas of natural gas, I guess.
And Iran is too, but obviously the sanctions there prevent that material getting to the global market. It's kind of the same field. But yeah, just they have unlimited gas, and then also off the coast of Australia, they have a lot of gas, which is kind of ironic because it's not near the population, so there's actually they're actually short gas on the southeast side of Australia where all the people live. But
on the other side of the continent.
Yeah. And then Argentina also with Vaca Muerta has a giant gas field, right? But they struggle to produce it because the regulatory environment there is just so terrible. And they are producing it, but it's limited because of the regulatory environment.
But again, it comes down to political, ideological decisions that don't make sense from a technical thing. And the war in Europe, the dependence that Germany went from having German nuclear power plants, very safe, perfectly modern. There's no tsunamis or earthquakes in Germany, and they got rid of them all for an ideological reason, so that they could be dependent on Russian gas, emitting carbon dioxide. It's insane. And now they've gone all wind and solar, so they're dependent on China for their energy security. It's insanity.
And something really wild is, they consider, especially in Europe, burning wood is a renewable resource.
We are chopping down forests in America to make wood chips, to send the wood chips to Europe to replace the coal that they were burning before.
And we are regrowing the forest, but one of the big problems with burning that stuff, even if you replace the forest, is they emit tons of PM 2.5, which is particulate 2.5 millimeter or micron in diameter less particulates, which are the ones that are most damaging for your lungs. When pollution is bad in the US and Europe, PM 2.5 is the main culprit. Sometimes it can be NOx. And burning that wood waste produces a ton of PM 2.5. So, because we can't just think about pollution. It's not just carbon dioxide. There's a lot of other pollutants that are, directly bad for our health. And we have to focus on those too. And that's kind of something Europe found out with their shift to diesel, which is, another interesting topic. Diesel saves you, 10 or 15% on CO2, but it emits all this PM 2.5. And that's why European cities typically have worse air quality than US cities, is because of that diesel.
Their diesel.
And passenger cars. And that's the issue with this wood chips, this, burning the biomass too, is you have to be cognizant, not just of CO2, but of what the full spectrum of pollutants looks like from what you're doing.
So I could talk about this for hours. I get very fired up about this stuff. I just heard this on a news report. I think it might've been a podcast. It was a really interesting point. There's all this demonization and hatred of the shale revolution. And by the way, this manifests itself in the Department of Energy. I work with DOE labs, and they're not allowed to say oil and gas. Like, that is a forbidden topic. We can't do research in that. A couple years ago, during the last administration, they were not allowed to say renewables. Like, it's crazy how the ideology comes in and affects the scientists who are actually trying to make smart decisions about our energy. So Russia gets a lot of they get all their money from resources, oil and gas, also minerals, and it's a resource economy. And had we not had the shale revolution, like, millions of barrels a day would be produced by Russia and therefore income generated in Russia as opposed to what we're making in America. So a lot of that oil and gas pot of money now goes to America. It would be going to Russia. And think about how much more they could have of an army to attack Europe with. It's a really big deal, the security that the shale revolution has given the West. It's not just what we're gaining ourselves, it's what the bad guys, so to speak, would be getting otherwise. And we need to open our eyes when it comes to wind, solar, and batteries. This wealth transfer in the 20th century, we did a huge wealth transfer to the Middle East. That didn't work out very well for us. And now we're doing the same wealth transfer to China for these renewable fuels, I think.
Yeah. Well, and that's what propped up the Soviet Union for, the last 20 years of its existence was energy exports. And that's what's propped up Putin's regime as well, is, that's where their foreign currency comes from, is energy exports.
Right.
And if they didn't have that, they wouldn't be able to do what they're doing. Right. I mean, that's what supports that oligarchy and the regime and everything that's going on there.
We need to be smarter about sanctions too, because you can't just immediately shift where you export oil and gas. Those pipelines and terminals take a long time, but essentially a lot of they're producing the same amount. They're not selling it in Europe. They're selling it to China and India. China and India have pretty good businessmen. They're negotiating lower prices. So basically the war in Europe, I think, is providing China and India with a competitive advantage because they're getting cheaper energy costs. Is that, you know more about the market. Is that true?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's, yes, it hurts Russia, but we're also, this is something Europe should have been thinking about a long time ago.
Yeah.
Right. Like you said, they could have been, after they saw Crimea and Georgia, why weren't they?
In Chechnya.
Chechnya.
And Syria. Yeah.
And Syria.
Yeah.
Why were they at that point still refusing to sign LNG contracts with U.S. providers? Because that's the thing about LNG. It's a big capital investment. So a U.S. provider, a U.S. exporter is not going to build a new LNG export terminal without a long-term commitment for volumes. And they were some combination of, they didn't want to make that commitment. They said, well, environmentally, we're not going to need this gas for that long.
Right.
Or because we're going to shift, which is totally unrealistic. If you're going to build out renewables, solar and wind, you need backup power, which has to be, essentially natural gas or coal. Those are really your two options. And so you're going to need some backup power. You're going to need the natural gas, and Russia can just undercut that, right? They could say, well, LNG is going to cost you this much. Well, we could sell it to you for 50 cents less, right? Essentially. I mean, it's not exactly like that, but right.
They're like iTunes for Europe. It's a monopoly.
Yeah.
If America comes in, it's not a monopoly anymore, and we can give them different options and competition.
Yeah, and Russia's not reliable, right? So yeah, they can say they're going to do that, but they're unpredictable. Who knows when they're going to invade Ukraine? And now all of a sudden you can't rely on that gas that was maybe some small discount versus if you would have been building out LNG import facilities in Europe and LNG export facilities on the Gulf Coast to go to Europe, they would have plenty of gas, and we wouldn't have seen their main natural gas benchmark this summer, TTF, I think got up over $80 per million BTU, or at least very close to that.
What's a normal price? Yeah.
We could say in 2019, I think that same price averaged about under 10 for the year of 2019, which was low.
Right.
Anything over 15 is high. And right now we're still in the 15 to 20 range. And the only reason we've gotten there is because they've, decreased natural gas consumption by 15 or 20%, which means people, not heating their homes to the temperature they want to heat them to. It means shutting down industry in Europe, right? If you need natural gas to produce things. It's a necessary input in terms of energy and heating, right, electricity, and directly in industrial processes.
Yeah.
And you need natural gas for a modern economy.
Yeah.
And, they're killing themselves by,
the question is why though? Because Germans are smart people. Like they're not dummies. They're very ideological, and the Fukushima reactor caused them to shut down their nuclear plants. And that was a completely emotional decision, which was a really bad one. But you know who Gerhard Schroeder is, right? The former German chancellor. He's
Yeah.
like the main guy. It's like George W. Bush or Barack Obama. And he went on the board to run the Nord Stream pipeline. So imagine if George W. Bush or Barack Obama went to work, not just like he worked for one of the main Russian companies supporting Putin, and he just shamelessly built this pipeline. And Angela Merkel did too. They're another president of Germany, the chancellor of Germany. I mean, at the highest levels of European politics, they joined Team Russia, and here we are.
And it right. It, like we said, pipeline's the best way to transport gas. Russia has a lot of gas. From a purely technical standpoint, it makes sense, right?
Yeah.
But the problem is you've also got to factor in geopolitics, and just relying on Russia, again, just because they're going to slightly undercut the cost of US LNG, or they say they will, that's not, something that you can rely on.
Yeah.
Right.
In the space industry, I always say it's not about the rocket science, it's about the political science. You can't have a good space program without the political backing. It's the same thing in energy. There's technical what's smart and what's not, but if you don't have the political system working on your side, you end up with Europe's energy situation that we have today.
Yeah.
So what do we need to do in America so we don't end up like that? In my mind, renewables and moving away from oil and gas is a good long-term thing. It's going to happen anyway. We're not making any more dinosaurs, right? So oil and gas is there. It's got a couple centuries. It's not the forever fuel that we need, but for now it is important, and it's going to continue to be used. And China and India are going to use lots of fossil fuels. So there's going to be lots of emissions. And I think we need to focus more on the mitigation side rather than spending massive amounts of dollars to make the Chinese Communist Party more wealthy. That's my personal view.
Yeah. And I think, a big thing is not making our supply chain so reliant on China, right? I mean, we would say relying on a single country is risky anyways, but especially when that single country has an authoritarian government that's, ideologically at odds with our own,
right? That's
not a good idea.
Right.
And it doesn't mean we need to reshore everything or that we can reshore everything, but if we can at least spread it out among different countries and countries that, are not, say, openly in competition to us,
Right.
Right. So you look at, India or Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam, whatever, right? I mean, diversify our supply chains and produce things here. So I live in northern Nevada. There's a big Thacker Pass lithium mine. It's a big project in northern Nevada to produce a lot of lithium. I don't know the volumes, but it would make a major dent in our lithium demand. And there's a lot of opposition from most of them, so-called environmentalists, right?
Right.
And if we want to build out batteries, if we want these things, we need lithium. It's better to produce it here. Not only is there security of supply if we produce it here, we're also going to do it in a more environmentally friendly way and a more human rights friendly way if we're going to do it here versus in China. And so it's
or Africa. A lot of those mines are in Africa or Indonesia. The processing happens in China, but the mining happens all around the world in terrible conditions. Using slave labor. Yeah.
And R&D too. You see these poll results. They'll ask people, how much are you willing to spend per month to stop global warming or to slow down global warming? And most people will say, I think it's under $15 a month, some small number. Right now, we're spending way more than that. I mean, if people knew how much they were spending, right, between all the programs that we have, it's just, you're not paying it directly, right? It's subsidies coming from the general fund, or it's the fuel standard. It's all different programs that people do pay for.
Well, if it's 300 billion and we have 300 million people, that's $1,000 per American.
Yeah, and I'd have to tally up.
Maybe it's more than that. So that's a lot of money.
It's a lot of money, and it's not. I'm not going to say how much should we be spending. Right? There's all kinds of estimates for the social cost of carbon. And because we're dealing with a cost that is 100 years in the future, right? Usually we're looking at what's the effect in, say, 2100 and 80 years from now. And the discounting back to the present, well, what discount rate do you want to use? Do you want to use 3%?
Is it
or
5%?
7%?
Right. Exactly.
That's big difference when you're talking about 80 years of discounting it.
Discounted cash flows. You bring me back to business school.
And then you combine that with the fact that nobody knows what's going to happen, right? For a given amount of CO2 emissions, you can look at the range of models for how much warming is it going to cause, and then what's the cost of the warming. We have no idea, right? We just know, essentially, we don't know what's going to happen, so we'd rather just not screw it up, right? That's what we know.
I agree with that. And sometimes, the big glacier drops off, and the tundra has these feedback loops where as it warms up, more methane gets emitted, and we don't know, and you don't really want to mess with a disaster.
Yeah,
so I think we should minimize it, but I think we also should do it in a cost-effective way. I just saw a documentary. There's a direct air capture. So I do a lot of carbon capture projects. And it makes sense to capture. If you're going to spend $100, you want to capture the most carbon you can, right? And direct air capture is the absolute worst. It's just setting up a machine in the middle of just air, just cleaning the air. And there's 420 or 440 parts per million. The amount of carbon dioxide in the air is really low. And so in Iceland, I think they spent $100 million on this carbon capture project, direct air capture, and it captures 6,000 tons a year. And if you stick that on a natural gas plant, or especially a coal plant, for the same $100 million, you could capture hundreds of thousands of tons, if not, 1 million tons a year. So as we spend this money, we shouldn't just waste it, especially since China's just increasing their emissions anyway. I'm working with an environmental organization that does land use, and they've got some good data. They need to get better, but they think their dollar per carbon captured is about 5% of the cost of these other big industrial ways. So in other words, my point is, we shouldn't just leave our kids with a terrible environment, but we also should do it smartly and in the most cost-effective way, because we don't have unlimited money. And if we just shoot ourselves in the foot and make ourselves less competitive while China and India emit all these emissions, that's not going to be good for our kids either.
Yeah. And a lot of those emissions in China and India are really ours, right? It's just that we feel like if we don't build the factory here, they don't count for us. But, how much of what we buy is made in China, right? Those are our emissions.
That's a great way that's a great way to look at it.
Yeah. And so that's another thing to think about. But that's not how we count it though, right? We say we've done such a good job decreasing our CO2 emissions because we've shut down all our manufacturing capacity, all our carbon intensive, all this carbon intensive metal processing, which is extremely carbon intensive.
Right.
We don't have any of that. We don't do any of that. We don't produce any steel anymore, not very much. Right. So we don't produce the CO2. Instead, now we're relying on China. So if, God forbid they do invade Taiwan or something.
Yeah.
Now we
won't have steel.
Reduce our CO2 emissions.
We won't have chips. Right.
Yeah. And now we don't have access to all these critical materials either. Yeah. And so it's the worst of both worlds.
In the 2000s, I was like, this really does not seem like a good idea to completely outsource everything to China. And here we are. So we need smarter decisions in government.
Yeah. And we need to think about the full life cycle. And, Toyota and Honda have talked about on the car side, hybrids right now are probably our best technology, right? Hybrids have gotten really good, or plug-in hybrids even. So we say full EV or nothing. And so we're using a scarce supply of batteries, and batteries are expensive and energy intensive to build. And we're building, 300-mile range EVs when you could build a plug-in hybrid with, say, 50 miles of range with a much smaller battery, or even less than 50 miles of range with a gas engine to back it up. And it's a hybrid gas engine. So even on the gas mode, you're going to get really good gas mileage. You do most of your driving on full electric mode. And now when you want to make a long trip, you can fill up at a gas station like normal.
Right.
You can get most of the CO2 benefit at a much lower cost. But it's this all or nothing, type attitude that is damaging. We're not getting to zero CO2 emissions in 2030 or 2040. That's not going to happen. Right.
I was at the Ford dealer this morning, as you know, and I was looking at an Escape plug-in hybrid. That's the car I want. I am preaching this from the highest mountain, Robert. you get 80% of the benefit for 20% of the cost. The cost being the cost, but also the environmental cost, also the energy security cost. Plug-in hybrids are the way to go in places like California and Europe. It just doesn't make sense. In Europe, I was just in Europe for a couple of weeks. People in Europe don't have garages with plugs. Like in these French towns, there's a million cars. They cram themselves onto the sidewalk. There's nowhere to plug in these cars, and it's just not going to happen. And if everybody had a plug-in hybrid, they'd be getting the emissions would go way down. And the amount of dependency on China and the environmental disaster that is mining would be much mitigated. And you could get all the cars that way. You could get 80% of the benefit for 20% of the cost, I think.
Yeah. And even regular hybrids. I mean, the new Priuses, which actually they redesigned it. The Prius actually looks like a pretty cool car now.
Yeah.
It looks good. And those things get like 55 miles per gallon. I mean, they're amazingly fuel efficient.
Right.
And, you know,
my parents have a Toyota SUV. It's wonderful. It's not plug-in, but they get really good gas mileage. And and they're fast too. Those batteries, if you step on the gas.
And you know, that's something with, you know, trucking and buses. CNG, we were going towards CNG a lot, compressed natural gas.
There you go. Yeah.
Which is it's good in that it reduces versus diesel, reduces carbon emissions by maybe 15 or 20%. So, you know, something, right? It's not zero. And it also reduces PM 2.5 and NOx emissions by 100%, essentially, right? Which, again, those are the main contributors to local air pollution. And we were going towards that a lot, right? The city of Dallas went to 100% CNG. I think Houston did too on their bus fleets. But now no one, and well, the barriers there are that one, the buses or trucks cost a little bit more, and you have to make the investment into fueling infrastructure. So most of them occurred on bus fleets originally, right? Because city of Dallas, you can justify building that fueling infrastructure because you're going to use it for your whole bus fleet. It's a big bus fleet. And so a lot of cities were doing that, and it's a good investment, but no one does it anymore because it's electric or nothing. So instead, we're building some small number of electric buses while keeping the rest diesel, when we could be going to whole fleets of CNG, and we could start using that for trucking too, and not only addressing, you know, carbon dioxide, but also addressing, you know, these pollutants that are toxic when we, right? And it's just these other technologies get ignored because we're so focused on EVs, or, you know, and it's not just EVs, but we get so focused on particular technologies that we have decided because of ideological reasons they sound the best.
Right.
We ignore technologies that, given our current level of technology, right? Maybe EVs, as batteries get better, full EVs will be the answer, and that's probably it. That's what it looks like right now, anyways, right? But with our current level of battery technology, it makes sense to do something else, and we shouldn't ignore these other technologies that make more sense, you know, right now.
I think the thing that makes sense is plug-in hybrids as a bridge, you know, for the next few decades until hydrogen comes along. Hydrogen's going to take time. That's not this decade, but in the long run, what fuels are just batteries. They're just energy storage. Like how many joules of energy can you get in a kilogram, right? And gasoline is really good. Diesel is really good. Jet fuel is a really, really great way to hold a lot of energy in a small amount of whatever. Electric fuels, instead of a gas tank, you have a battery, and it's not as good. But so hydrogen is basically just another battery to store energy. But in the year 2300, I think stuff's going to be powered by hydrogen, but that's still down the road a little bit. And plug-in hybrids just make a lot of sense. And fully electric 18-wheelers, I know Elon is making that. That just does not make sense. And it's a long ways out. I mean, we, like with electricity, start with the smallest engines first, right? The smallest engine is going to be the least efficient. You know, it's actually like lawn equipment. Like, you know, start with electrifying those, right? You start with the smaller the engine, the more it makes sense to electrify. Right.
And we shouldn't be jumping straight to heavy trucking. Like those are the last thing to electrify, right? First we go with the light duty vehicles and move up. And there's actually, you know, some company, it was a good technology as hybrid CNG trucks, which serves two purposes. One, you get better fuel economy because you're capturing, your waste energy in a battery. But two, CNG struggles with torque, which obviously is a big issue with trucking. If you want to go over hills, you supplement that with an electric motor, you can help with that torque. And it's a good technology, but it's not all. So nobody cares because it's not all electric. So we view it as a dead end technology, and that's it.
Yeah. The other aspect of batteries, we're talking about mostly transportation, but the much bigger universe of the battery market is not for cars, it's for power plants, right? Like a wind and solar power plant. These places build massive battery farms, like unbelievable quantities of batteries, which is going to drive up the price, right? Because the demand not only is for the car batteries, but it's for these huge wind and solar, because the sun doesn't shine at night. On cloudy days, you lose a lot of sun, and the wind doesn't blow all the time. So these batteries are a huge problem. And I'm working with a friend of mine down in Australia to help them with some of their energy stuff. And their government has a goal, I think by 2030, so 7 years, 92% wind and solar. Like they want to completely transform the whole country, which is insanity. It's going to be a massive check they're going to write to China. And it's not going to happen, I don't think. But think about the amount of batteries that Australia is going to need to do that.
Well, the thing there is, like, we solved this issue in the 1960s, and it's called nuclear, right? And there's
only there was an emission-free, clean, really safe. By the way, nobody died from the nuclear plant at Fukushima. Thousands of people were killed by the tsunami, unfortunately, but the nuclear plant was not the problem. It was the tsunami.
And there were all kinds of design flaws, right? And we could apply lessons learned, and you could apply that to all the other nuclear plants in Japan. And now they're ready for the next tsunami, right? It's not like there was no way to address it. They identified all kinds of issues. And
they built the backup generator on the floor. And if they would have put the backup generator on the roof, the plant would not have shut down. I mean, literally all they had to do was put the generator up above the water level, and it would have been okay.
And so coal plants actually emit, if you live near a coal plant, you're exposed to a lot more radiation than living near a nuclear plant, because we actually have far lower thresholds for radiation exposure near nuclear plants than coal plants. Because people, it sounds scary, right? Nuclear sounds, we have this idea of some green, gooey nuclear waste, but it's really a good technology. And the thing is, it's not as if we can just go build it, because first we have to change public opinion. As long as people have this fear of nuclear, there's a tremendous, advocacy campaign to make people scared of nuclear. Because some people were scared of it and they promoted that. And now everyone's scared of nuclear. No one wants to live near a nuclear power plant or nuclear waste, not realizing what it really is. And so, the first step is to, teach people that it is the safest. Not only is it zero carbon, it's also safe. It doesn't expose you to radiation. Even living pretty close to one doesn't expose you to radiation. You can build it anywhere. You're not dependent on the natural environment. It's tremendous technology, but until we can convince people that it's a good technology, the costs are going to be sky high, because you've got to deal with so much opposition to every single project.
It's worse than pipelines.
Yeah. That's the one thing that's worse than oil and gas is nuclear. And
so we're outsourcing all this stuff to China. Like you said, you're outsourcing they'll build the wind and solar for us. They're happy to do that. So,
and they're building nuclear too. They build a lot of coal, but they build a lot of nuclear too.
Right. Robert, this has been really fascinating. Thanks for coming on. I think the takeaway is oil and gas is really complicated. Everybody was up in arms, oh my God, Biden's raising the price of gas. And I'm like, it might be because Russia just invaded Ukraine. That might have something to do with it. But there's a lot of complicated things that go into the price of gas. So that's the point.
Yeah. And he did it right as we had shut down, we didn't mention it, but shut down, several million barrels per day of refining capacity globally during COVID. And, and then demand is coming back at the same time. Yeah. Big mess.
Yeah. Well, refining capacity, that was the other thing. how are we for refining capacity? We haven't built a new refinery since the 70s or something like that, right?
Yeah. So the last, real new full conversion refinery in the U.S. that we built was Garyville, Louisiana, in the 1970s. But refining capacity has grown a lot since then in the U.S., and refinery crude runs have grown even more because
So is demand. I mean, the population's grown, and yeah.
But the U.S. has become the world's largest exporter of refined products.
Okay.
Mostly to Latin America, right? Because refining is a complicated business. It's probably the manufacturing business. It is the manufacturing business that the U.S. is the most competitive in. We do really well in it without subsidies. We're a major exporter. Latin America can't operate a refinery
Right.
because the regulatory environment, it's all government owned. They're dependent on us for their product, and we're increasingly in the future likely to export more to Africa and Europe as well. So we've actually grown our, refinery runs, refinery capacity, even as we've shut down some older, less efficient capacity. So it's not like we need to build new refining sites, right? But we need to continue to invest in our existing refineries, make them, more efficient. We can continue to, we think that U.S. demand has peaked, right, for gasoline and diesel and jet fuel, combined. U.S. demand's probably already peaked, or at least very close to it.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't mean that we should be decreasing our refining capacity. We can still supply the rest of the world. It's a good manufacturing business, right? I mean, if we want to address the trade deficit, we have the crude production here. We talked a little bit earlier about crude imports, right? Most of these imports come from Canada by pipeline. If we don't run it in our refineries, it's still going to pass through the U.S. So we could think of that kind of like domestic crude, right? Yeah, it's produced in a different country, but it has to flow through the U.S. first, right? Because the pipelines go to the Gulf Coast.
Right.
So even if we were to not run it in our refineries, it would be exported from, U.S. Gulf Coast ports. And because the light shale crude we produce is more valuable than the Canadian crude, it makes more sense to export our own light shale crude because we don't have enough refining capacity to process it all, right? And we have these big complex refineries that can run Canadian heavy crude. And then we also bring in crude from Mexico and other parts of Latin America. We also have a law called the Jones Act, which makes it very expensive to ship crude from the Gulf Coast to the West Coast or the East Coast. So that means that they import most of their crude. That's a whole nother topic. That's a lot more complicated. But essentially, people say, well, we're still importing crude oil, mostly from Canada, and we're importing crude oil because it's cheaper and because of the Jones Act. That's why. Those three reasons explain it all.
That's a fascinating thing. There was a similar act for aviation that was designed to keep Southwest down, right? When Southwest grew in the 70s, I forgot the name of the act, but
the Wright Amendment.
The Wright Amendment. They weren't allowed to fly to neighboring states.
And I'm from Dallas area, and Love Field. It was they built DFW Airport in the 70s, I think it was.
Okay.
And they wanted DFW and it was part of federal funding. They needed to ensure DFW would get used well.
Right.
Right. And so there was the existing Love Field Airport in Dallas. Southwest negotiated, they wanted to close that. Southwest negotiated a deal, said, okay, we'll only fly to Texas and neighboring states. And I think they made an exception for like Kansas City and St. Louis. And that's all we're going to fly to. And so if you let us keep this airport open. And so they agreed, and they called that the Wright Amendment to let the Love Field State open. And say it was attacking Southwest. It was actually Southwest who negotiated that. And Southwest made a ton of money off of it because no one else wanted to fly from Love Field. Everyone said that's not worth it. Right. And Southwest came in and said, we can exploit this opportunity. It's going to be super cheap gate space. We could take advantage of this. And they made a whole business, starting flying out of Love Field
to Midland and Oklahoma City. Yeah.
And then up to Kansas City and St. Louis.
Yeah.
And they built a whole business out of that and expanded from that. So, and then later they swung it as, see, everyone's attacking us. They won't let us fly. This is our airport in Dallas. It's like, yeah, you chose that airport because it's cheap. And now, Southwest has this monopoly on Love Field. Like they have, I think there's like 25 gates there and Southwest has 21 of them.
Yeah. Well, it's like Hobby. I'm down here in Houston. It's Hobby is the Southwest airport.
Yeah. So it's kind of funny how they swung that. It's like attacking Southwest. No, you took advantage of like this.
You profited from it.
Yeah, well, they took advantage of an opportunity that no one else was willing to take a risk on, right? Everyone else said that's not even worth it. If all we can fly are these short haul routes, it's not worth it.
Right.
And Southwest said we can make it work. And so, I mean, you got to give them credit for coming up with that business plan, to do something that no one else wanted to do, but also it wasn't attacking Southwest.
Right.
Right.
Well, and over time though, it became it was good for them in the 70s and 80s, but
yeah, well, it was really good for them that they got it removed because they agreed to those conditions, right?
Right.
And I'm glad it got removed. As someone who used to live in Dallas near Love Field, it was really convenient going to Love Field instead of having to go all the way to DFW.
Yeah. Plus DFW is a monster. It's
yeah.
Anyway. Well, look, Robert, this is great. This is a long conversation, but there's a million things, and energy is important. It runs our lives. We live in this modern lifetime where you can expect to live into your 80s because of fossil fuels, and things are changing. We need to be smart about not polluting the environment and helping our kids out in the future, but we need to be smart about it. That's my point. We need to make fact-based decisions, not emotional-based decisions, and hopefully we can do more of that in the future.
All right. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on. And if you love the podcast, by the way, don't forget to subscribe and give us a rating.